So I've started the recording, huh?
Yeah. Okay, tell me when you guys can see my screen.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, all right. Let's do a full screen and let's begin. Okay, so hi everyone. So this is the first class in our kind of reconfiguring modernity exercise. Okay, so this one is called the age of apocalypse. And if you remember, last class we had created a kind of a diagram which put this idea in the center of reconfiguring modernity and surrounding it with all the possible kind of idea and concepts that can actually or that have actually been substantial in really questioning the idea of modernity and in our kind of sort of theorizing, it is also intending to reconfigure this idea of modernity. What we have today is the idea of the apocalypse. Okay, a brief definition of apocalypse. An apocalypse is knowledge, okay, as the definition states. In religious and occult concepts, an apocalypse usually discloses something very important that was hidden or provides a vision of heavenly secrets that can make sense of earthly realities. Okay, very interesting definition. Although, as a noun, apocalypse is also referred to as the complete final destruction of the world. To me, it seems that these two sort of many ways are creating the dialectic between which the idea of reconfiguring modernity lies somewhere. Okay, just sorry, just hold on. Yeah. So what this presentation essentially is in two parts. The first part is, of course, the war as uh, the collection of the apocalypse, the first war and the second war, and the second is the larger kind of a situation caused or caused by man or caused by the environment, and within which we are going to look at the early environmental responses, which include Buckminster Fuller, Jonna Friedman, Paolo Soleri, and many others. And then we end with the idea of the Habitat Forum. Yeah, just hold on a second, guys. Ira, Mir, Ira, Ira, can you be quiet, please, and can you close the door? Yeah. Okay, so this is an image of German soldiers with their cavalry in during the First World War. What the First World War did in many ways is it created it actually unified the world in the war in some way or the other. This is also the first time that new machinery was used for the purpose of war. You had extensive machine guns that were that the entire sort of industrial mechanization processes had set up. You also had the first time chemical warfare being used in war, and these are soldiers that are actually wearing masks the soldiers were actually throwing chlorine gas on other soldiers. Okay, so the World War One created a scale of casualty that was unknown to the world. Okay, around about 40 million people were actually affected, of which 22 million deaths occurred and about 23 million wounded personnel, making it one of the deadliest sort of conflicts. Another thing that happened during the period of the war is that the rate of birth rates, particularly in Europe, dramatically shrunk. Okay, so these are some of the kind of broad effects of the war. The First World War altered the map of Europe, and many new nations emerged out of particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. Okay, a lot of new nations also sort of claim from the kind of Russian, a large kind of empire that was there. Yeah, so this is just a map of sort of impacts of the war, including shortages of food, shortages of energy. There was a call for coal and bread that happened during this time. Yeah, and a new map emerged at the end of this war with new nations. You can see several new nations like Yugoslavia, Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Finland. All of these nations are actually carved out at the end of the First World War. This is also the beginning of the end of the kind of colonial kind of establishments. Yeah, so the empires are breaking up in this stage in many ways. The war itself sort of was fought in trenches. It's called the War of the Trenches, and elaborate trench kind of systems were created all across the fighting zones, especially in France and in Germany. The trenches required troops to be sort of service, so you had all kinds of sort of sanitation methods that were employed, and these trenches sometimes were long, and they went across many square kilometers. The gun has become a very prominent kind of a weapon at this time, and trench was considered one of the best ways of defending your army against the gun. Yeah. What happened as a result of the trench is that new machines were developed to actually circumvent the trenches, and these are just some of the tanks came in place because you needed an armor to face the bullet. Yeah, but you also needed to move ahead. Okay, so you can see these are on the left, on the top two are the British tanks that were developed primarily to sort of go over trenches. On the left bottom is a Russian tank. In middle is a Citroën, a French tank. And even the right hand side is a Citroën, which is a French tank. Citroën is the same company that manufactures the Citroën cars, by the way. Yeah. What happened at the end of the war was a treaty of peace was signed. It was called the Treaty of Versailles, that made Germany and its allies responsible for the damages that were caused by the war. It also meant that the German and its allies had to pay for those damages. Uh, uh, but this was a very strange situation because it primarily came from the insistence. A lot of the money for the war was given to Europe and France by America, and the Americans asked that money to be returned back. Okay, as a result of this, the British and the French forces made the Germans pay this money back as reparation against the damages that were caused. And interestingly, the story unfolds. This is also the time when the world now comes together, okay, in a consolidated way to prevent such occurrences, such large-scale occurrences, and forms the League of Nations. Yeah, this is actually the precursor to the United Nations that was formed after the Second World War. Okay, the period after the war is very interesting because although the war has created damages, the war has also allowed for new sort of possibilities to emerge. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about two exhibitions that happened in the period between the wars. This is the International Exhibition of Modern and Decorative Industrial Arts that happened in 1925. If you this happened in Paris. If you look at most of the kind of buildings and architectures that were created, they were mainly in the Art Deco kind of a style. Yeah. And these are the pavilions that were built during that time. This is the Belgian pavilion, the Swedish pavilion, the Danish pavilion, Dutch, Italian, British, etc. Of course, the Russian pavilion, if you see, is remarkably different, and so is to some extent the Danish pavilion. The rest of them are pretty much pavilions which are built in the kind of decorative style. Yeah. In 1926, okay, shortly after the end of the Paris Art Exposition, the French Union of Modern Artists, a group which included Le Corbusier, etc., fiercely attacked the style, which they said was created only for the wealthy, and its form was determined by their tastes. The modernists, as they became known, insisted that well-constructed buildings should be available to everyone, and that form should follow function. The beauty of an object or a building resided in whether it was perfectly fit to fulfill its function. Okay, modern industrial methods meant that furniture and buildings could be mass produced and not by hand anymore. Okay, of course, one of the highlights of this particular exhibition was the Eiffel Tower, which was not within the site, but it was clearly visible from the exhibition. The Citroën company, the same company that was manufacturing tanks during the war period, decorated the tower from top to bottom with 200,000 light bulbs in 6 colors. The lights could be controlled from a keyboard and presented 9 different patterns, including geometric shapes, circles, stars and the signs of zodiac, and of course the prominent kind of name Citroën. Yeah, the the pavilions in this particular exhibition also had one special pavilion which was which was conceived as a modular dwelling. Yeah, this was a pavilion designed by Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier and Pierre Janet both together. They, of course, ideologically diverged from the Art Deco style. Yeah, they felt that architecture is too removed from human needs and emphasized on function and sought drastically to diminish decoration. And what you see in this image is their pavilion is actually a house. Okay, a fairly compact kind of a house with furniture, with accessories, with your entire kitchen, etc. That is actually mass produced in factories and in industries. Okay, and this was considered an idea of something that can be accessed by everyone and not only the elite. Yeah. Okay. At the same time, what happened in the post First World period is large scale kind of efforts at building housing for people who have now become part of a new nation in some way. You should remember the Austro-Hungarian Empire is broken. Austria is now a nation, and there are large scale projects that happen in Austria and in other places. I'm going to show you some of them. There are 2 projects that are here. Both of them are housing projects. One is Karl Marx Hof and the second is Rabenhof. This is a plan of Rabenhof. What was interesting of this particular kind of change in the idea of how you settle and how cities can be built is that the private and the public functions started to intermingle, especially in this scheme. All the buildings that you see in cut plan are actually public functions. They are markets, they are banks, they are post offices, they are supermarkets, etc., etc. The ones that you see in black are the places where the housing is built, and you can see the staircases cut in between. This is an aerial view of Rabenhof, which is recently taken, but you will see that this was a remarkably different way of conceiving the entire way in which you can subdivide the plots. Unlike the other plots, where you saw there was a plot and there was a building in the perimeter of that small plot, here there was a consolidation of many plots to create this kind of a mega plot, where then the building could actually create a perimeter and hold green spaces on the inside. Yeah, these are some of the examples of post-war reconstruction in the UK. On the left-hand side is what is called St Andrew's Garden in Liverpool. Again, very similar to Karl Marx Hof in terms of the aesthetic and simplicity. Second is a Quarry Hill. It's a model of a housing estate in Leeds. Long kind of perimeter walls that could wrap around, and creation of an open space in between. And then there was the extended kind of housing estates on the outskirts of London. Yeah. Okay. Furthermore, these are some of the other kind of large-scale housing blocks that came up. This is Park Hill in Sheffield, and this one is called Robin Hood Gardens. All of them are actually built by the housing boards. Okay. what happens during the First World War and its post kind of period. Okay, the lingering effects of the war cause economic problems in many countries. Not wanting to be saddled with the cost of European war, United States demanded allies repay money loaned to them during the conflict. The allies took the position that if they had to do that, they would have to collect reparations from Germany, as I had explained. Okay, and hence the Treaty of Versailles. But Germany, which means required to pay billions of dollars in reparation to Britain, France, Belgium, and others. What ensued was a vicious flow of money back and forth across the Atlantic, as it was American bankers that ended up lending money to Germany to pay reparations to allies to repay their debts back to the United States. Okay, so what this created was this condition that I'm asking for money from one person, but I'm also giving money to another person to give to that person so that he can give it back to me. So this resulted in an economic condition that led primarily to what is called the Great Depression. Okay, the Great Depression created joblessness across America, large scale kind of unemployment that ensued after that resulted in the establishment of a program called the New Deal by Roosevelt. Okay, so what the New Deal did is the unemployment that was happening particularly in the US was they gave a lot of money to build to create a building activity where many kinds of people could be employed. So projects that came up in America were primarily under the New Deal kind of money establishment. They were infrastructure projects. They were also arts and culture projects that actually happened. Here you can see there's a lodge, there's a riverwalk in Texas, there's an aquatic park in San Francisco. There is the Dock Street Theater. There's an armory, and there's the Hoover Dam. The famous Hoover Dam gets constructed in this period during the Great Depression, and it's later kind of New Deal money. Okay, while the 19th century was a time of unprecedented technological progress in terms of construction, however, while buildings were constructed according to new designs with the use of new materials, in most cases they remained rather traditional in visual sense. It took the shock of First World War for architects to offer the world an entirely new aesthetic, which brought out the opportunities and advantages of new materials and construction methods. Newly developed innovations like radios, phonographs, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, refrigerators emerged out of the market during this period. These new items were expensive, but consumer purchasing innovations like store credits and installment plans made them available to the largest segment of the population. Okay, a general timeline just to get ourselves again focused. So we we saw the establishment of League of Nations in 1920, and this is the period between the two wars. We saw the Paris Exposition that happens, and then there is a period of Great Depression in between, and the next exposition that happens again in Paris is worth noting. It's called the World Exposition of 1937. Remember, this is just before the Second World War. Actually, the atmosphere for the Second World War is already set in motion by then. So what was this exposition? Okay, here's an image of the 1937 exposition outlining all the different kind of pavilions that were supposed to be sort of built, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that happened during this pavilion is Germany actually decided not to participate in this exposition. It was Albert Speer who convinced Hitler that it was essential for Germany to actually put itself out there in this exposition to show that they have the might of a superpower in many ways. Okay, so the way the exhibition was set up is that the Russian pavilion was put right opposite the German pavilion, and you can see the remarkable kind of a difference in the expressions. But again, where is the idea of the modern? Okay, the idea of the modern was put on a back burner over here completely. Okay, this was again in many ways a call for the kind of classical and kind of classical order that establishes the sense of power and might of a certain kind. Yeah. But this was not only in the German or the Russian kind of pavilion architecture. This was also the general kind of atmosphere of what is good architecture. Okay, older buildings that stood on this ground, which were built during the 1900 kind of exposition were brought down, and newer kind of buildings that were that would fit within the idea of modernism, or within the idea of modernism, or rather in the monumental kind of tradition of Ledoux and many others, were brought into play back again in 1937. Of course, the modernists were not very happy with this particular kind of an exercise. Undaunted, the following of tradition of Repousse, painters from earlier expositions, Corbusier and his followers erected a huge tent outside the exposition ground. Okay, inside they set forth his models and plans for ideal city of the future. Yeah, somebody has said that it was one of the most exciting moments of this exposition. Of course, in the temporary pavilion that was built on the inside, you saw an aircraft that was suspended. You saw many different ideas of what kind of habitats can be built, and you also saw Corbusier's idea for the expansion of Paris over here on the right hand side, if you can see. Yeah. Elsewhere, some of the other kind of pavilions that came up in the same exhibition was the Palace of Air, which made the entire aircraft as this kind of uh, beacon of progress and prosperity, and then and this idea that can create we can today fly from anywhere to anywhere. The American kind of pavilion, and also a pavilion for the railways, which was constructed the railway, and the aircraft becoming a primary kind of engines of modernity. Okay, in this exposition, the ritual of peace and progress was over. Medals were distributed, and the conquering exhibitors of 44 nations politely applauded each other during the closing ceremonies in 1937. Soon the participants departed to their fortified cities and prepared to arm human pride with tools of technology for the forthcoming tournament of blood. In the city of light, the lamps were extinguished and the ultimate confrontation was at hand. Yeah. Okay, this sets a kind of uh, the idea of this presentation is also to constantly keep looking at what is happening in the realm of architecture, and what is happening to the idea of the modern in many ways through the idea of architecture. Yeah. So what happens? 1937, the World Exposition ends. 1939, Germany and Russia invade Poland, and that sets off the entire Second World War period. Okay, go ahead. Uh, Simultaneously, a little before 1937, the Gestapo had already closed down the Berlin school, which is the Bauhaus school. Yeah, Mies had protested. They were allowed to keep it on for some more time, but that really didn't really work. Finally, the other teachers of Bauhaus themselves decided that they would actually close the school. Nazi writers called or labeled the Bauhaus as un-German and criticized its modernist styles, deliberately generating public controversy over issues like flat roofs. Increasingly through the 1930s, they characterized the Bauhaus as a front for communists and social liberals. Okay. Indeed, a number of communist students loyal to Mayer were moved, and they were fired, etc. By 1939, more than 300 modernist architects from Germany and Austria, along with others from Russia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and Romania, had already started moving and had settled in UK. The most famous of these architects include Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, Eric Nelson, etc. Many, but not all, were Jewish refugees. Many actually sought home in United States also. So there was like the war created an atmosphere of exodus of many of the modernist kind of architects out of Germany. A very significant event that happened very early on in the onset of the war was actually establishment of the Axis powers. Yeah, Axis was between Italy, Germany, and Japan. This is the tripartite pact between Germany, Japan, and Italy in 1940. Yeah. This also sort of in many ways reflected the kind of gap in the bridge in the League of Nations. The League of Nations was unable to actually prevent the war. Many claim that it was primarily because America did not get involved in the conflict and kept a safe distance, since the war was not happening at their own doors. Okay, the Second World War ensued, massive destruction of cities. I think this is Dresden in Germany. The city was completely destroyed by bombings caused by Allied forces. But of course, these are not the only ones. Large-scale devastations happened across most cities in Europe. This is Rotterdam on the left, Cologne on the right. Cologne you can see, except for the central spire, most of the city is actually razed to ground. And this is Wesel in Germany, which was also absolutely obliterated by the Allied bombing. by the Allied bombing. Okay, strange architectures emerged in the period of war. Yeah, these are called flat towers, or rather watchtowers. These are in Vienna, and the one on the top right is in Hamburg. Okay, these are German Nazi-built concrete towers, which would also hold anti-aircraft guns. They were impenetrable. In places like Vienna, where they actually thought of removing these towers, they finally decided it's too much energy to actually just remove them. So they have left it. And as you can see, the one on the right bottom has been now turned into a museum with an extended kind of a gallery that looks out and things like that. But another kind of architecture also emerged in this kind of war period under the sort of Axis power. This thing on the left hand side actually is series of granaries that were built along various canals and rivers that actually provided food for the soldiers. Especially this is of course German soldiers that were moving up and down various cities. This is on the outskirts of Vienna. In the middle is the plan for Berlin, I think, by Albert Speer. That was actually the kind of center of his entire exercise. For some reason, this plan looks very familiar now. And on the right hand side is the famous Auschwitz concentration camp. An architecture for death, architecture to actually kill people. Sort of en masse, architecture that would employ gases and things like that would actually strip people naked, that would haul them as pigs and basically kill them and burn them. Yeah. The war ended with this. These are two kind of mushroom clouds that emerged one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki, 3 days apart from each other. The war actually brought us this close kind of a view of absolute obliteration and destruction. Yeah, very powerful images from the war. This is actually Nagasaki. You can see on the top was the town before it was destroyed. You can see at the bottom is the town after the destruction of the bomb, and that's ground zero right there. Yeah. Many other cities across the world, not just in Japan, actually saw large-scale devastations. These are three kind of big cities in Japan. The red marks the amount of cities that were destroyed. Okay. Second World War ends with a deadly kind of deadly kind of deaths. Okay, 85 million people perish, which was about 3% of the total world population. Yeah, deaths directly caused by war, deaths that were caused by war-related diseases and famine, civilian deaths, military deaths, and so on and so forth. I was quite surprised that, and a little, I mean, we know very little about the destruction that happened in China, which was caused primarily by Japanese kind of extensions. Huge amount of destruction happened in China next to Soviet Union. Large amount of deaths that happened in India were primarily actually related to civilian deaths that were caused by problems of famine, which means that the colonies had pulled out large amount of food from the colony and taken it for war relief in their own in the war efforts. Yeah. Okay, so then the apocalypse. Okay, what did the apocalypse reveal in this particular case? So it revealed three kind of sort of trends. One, that machines of progress became beacons of destruction. Yeah, where the aircraft was seen as this flight into future, became actually one of the most sort of destructive weapons of the war. Yeah. Second thing it revealed is that the impact of war reflected the interconnected world order. Okay, no one escaped the war. Quite literally, the wars in the waters were fought across the entire sort of water of the world. Okay, there were Germans and allied ships and submarines chasing each other all the way across to North Australia, North Australia, Sumatra. I mean, they just went everywhere. The indirect consequence was colonial powers extracting military and resources for the war efforts from across the entire world. Okay, and man's supremacy over nature reached a new high or a low, whichever one you want to call it. I've kept this image over here because it's particularly telling. This is it's called, I think, the B-52 bomber or something like that, going over, I think it's Kobe city. And there's another aircraft flying over it, taking pictures while the bombing is actually happening. Okay. So the entire Hiroshima Nagasaki ends the war. It also creates or it rather brings together the entire world under the banner of the United Nations. Yeah. UN. The first conference was held on April 25th, 1945. What is interesting to note is that it is actually in August of 1945 that the Americans bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the ideas of the UN had already started taking in place, but it took effect on 24th October 1945. Yeah, the organization's objectives included maintaining international peace, security, protecting human rights, delivering humanitarian aid, promoting sustainable development, upholding international law. Okay, post this war, also known as the post-war economic boom or the golden age of capitalism. Okay, suddenly the war is over and cities have to be rebuilt. Large amount of construction has to happen, particularly in Europe. So two ways in which the kind of Western world, which was relatively the center of power by then, had started to sort of move. One is reconstruction of towns in Europe, and the second is suburban growth and development in America. Yeah, there actually a large amount of money was invested back by America into reconstruction of both the Allied as well as the Axis power countries. Yeah, this was done under the name of what is called the Marshall Plan. Large scale, somewhere around $12 billion was loaned to different countries across Europe for reconstruction efforts. The other thing that allowed for reconstruction efforts, or rather that allowed people the purchasing power for all the new commodities that now could be produced in factories that were actually manufacturing weapons, was the fact that they had invested in victory bonds. Okay, so which means that people had actually put bonds in the war effort, and once the war ended, and the Allied forces actually were able to pay those bonds to people, give the money in hands of people to buy commodities. So post-war kind of boom is a boom of commodity kind of purchasing, commodification, as well as reconstruction. Okay, I now move a little bit ahead to 1960s. 1960s, I'm moving a little bit ahead because this kind of boom of post-war continued. The reconstruction of cities happened. It took around about, say, 15 years. Large-scale infrastructure projects took place. All your bringing back the metros, bringing back connectivities, building housing, etc., happened in those 50 years. I come to 1960s because it brought back some of the most immediate concerns that people had already started flagging post-war. on the nature of environment and what commodification and industries are actually doing to environment. On the left hand side is a very famous book called The Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. The book was published in 1962 and documented the adverse environmental effects caused by indiscriminate use of pesticide. Okay, Carson became concerned about the use of pesticides in the 1940s, many of which had been developed through military funding of science after World War II. Okay, so which involved kind of what were these pesticides? It involved aerial spraying of DDT and other pesticide mixed with fuel oils for private land, and this prompted Rachel Carson to actually devote her entire research on the environmental impacts and poisoning that had happened. So this became a very important moment when the book was released, to starting to look at what are the effects of environment. The other book that comes out in 1968 is called The Population Bomb, which predicted worldwide famine in 1970s and 80s and due to overpopulation, as well as major societal upheavals, and advocated immediate action to limit population growth. Okay. Of course, we know now that the population bomb did not really actually happen, but it did sort of bring several kinds of changes in policies, especially in India and China as well, and that's called for later. For later somewhere we'll talk about that. Okay, so kind of a new environmental movements get set up in the 60s. Actually, all the way from 60s to 1976 is a period where there is not just the new environmental kind of movements, but there is a challenging of the kind of order that has been set up post Second World War, an order of rampant kind of consumerist capitalism, an order of where the cities have come back to their ideas of modern kind of planning, etc. Okay, we are now going to look at some of the kind of resistances that emerge during this period. Yeah, the resistances, and we are now specifically going to look at some of the architectures that emerged during this time. On the left hand side is a firm called Superstudio, which was founded in 1966 by Italian architects Adolfo Natalini and Cristiano Toraldo. Okay, and I'm just going to read out something that Natalini wrote. If design is merely an inducement to consume, then we must reject design. If architecture is merely the codifying of bourgeois model of ownership and society, then we must reject architecture. If architecture and town planning is merely the formalization of present unjust social divisions, then we must reject town planning and its cities until all design activities are aimed towards meeting primary needs. Until then, design must disappear. We can live without architecture. Through their models, Superstudio proposed an alternative strategy of life without objects, a view of architectural practice as essentially theoretical, with a primary focus on cultural criticism. And you guys can Google. Superstudio created several such conceptual sort of drawings to illustrate what it is to illustrate how we can actually arrest this kind of capitalism of our towns and our cities. On the right hand side is another kind of another kind of an idea which is actually deeply rooted in the kind of consumerist attitudes. Yeah, Archigram, we all know the firm Archigram, was an avant-garde architectural group in the 60s that was neo-futuristic, anti-heroic and pro-consumerist, drawing inspiration from technology in order to create a new reality that was solely expressed through hypothetical projects, committed to high-tech, lightweight, infrastructural approaches that focused on survival technology. Okay, the group, they experimented with modular kind of technology, mobility environments, space capsules, and a lot of mass consumerist imagery. So here are three examples of their ideas of cities. One is called a walking city, where the entire city actually moves. The second one, the middle one, is called the plug-in cities, where there is an infrastructure in place and you can come and plug into it. And the third one is called a pop-up city, that suddenly happens instantaneously when activities come together and there is an ability to just start a city over there. Radical ideas from the 60s that were brought in both by Superstudio and Archigram. Okay. Elsewhere in America, there was another kind of radical idea that was taking shape. This is Buckminster Fuller. Okay, Fuller operated as a philosopher who demonstrated his ideas as inventions and called them artifacts. He did not limit himself to one field, but worked as comprehensive anticipatory design scientist, he called himself, to solve global problems surrounding housing, shelter, transportation, education, energy, ecological destruction, and poverty. Yeah. Buckminster Fuller spent his life working on multiple fields such as architecture, design, geometry. I don't think, and Rohan, you can correct me, I don't think Buckminster Fuller was actually trained as an architect. Yeah. I've never come across, I mean, I could not find anywhere where it said that he had graduated from the school. No, he's never trained. He never trained, yeah. In his pursuit to make a world work for 100% of humanity. So what were Buckminster Fuller's ideas? Yeah. Here are three conceptual ideas that he sets out. One is the first one on the left is in 1943. Remember, Fuller is in operation with these ideas way before the kind of new environmental movements have taken shape. Okay, he was very progressive in understanding the limits of material and was constantly in quest for actually optimizing and creating an efficiency of things. Yeah, all three are actually examples of the same. He calls these ideas Dymaxion, which is a term that merges the words dynamic, maximum, and tension together. So on the left in 1943, he created a map called the Dymaxion map. Fuller took on cartography with this invention, credited it as the first two-dimensional map of the entire Earth's surface that shows it without distortions. Okay. The second one is a Dymaxion house, and we'll look at some drawings of this house later. That merges, okay, we've already talked that. In the final proposal, of course, for the house, he used, it was an aluminum kind of a sheet metal with column structures supporting the main center. Yeah, a number of autonomous design features also included, like a cone that extended from the top to aid natural ventilation, etc. And on the right hand side, one of his most sort of what do you say, juicy designs is the Dymaxion car, and I ended up seeing this car in New York in an exhibition. It's quite sexy. It is a three-wheeled car that makes that could make extremely tight turns. If you guys later on, you can see there are some videos of the car moving on roads. Yeah, I mean, it was designed as an investigation into the taxiing stage of an aircraft and the first phase in developing an automobile for both driving on land and flying. So imagine that this could actually eventually take off as an aircraft. Yeah. He did do 2 or 3 prototypes of the same. Here is one of his Dymaxion kind of a house. Yeah. If you see closely, the house is in many ways a machine for living. Yeah. But in Fuller's kind of imagination, that machine is completely self-reliant. That it actually can be airdropped in any location, and it starts operating. It has solar panels that can draw energy. It has the ability to actually tap into geothermal kind of energies, etc., etc. Okay, and always conscious of the fact that that you had many of the older kind of aircraft. So imagine that this could be built with the abundance of aluminum that had come in the aftermath of the Second World War. Okay, so he imagined this in that kind of a context. Some of the later prototypes of his Dymaxion house that and some of them that actually got built were they looked a little different. Again, built with aluminum kind of sheet metal that came out of aircraft, demolish aircrafts and things like that. These could be pods that could be set up or dropped in any location and were self kind of reliant. They did not require services on the outside. Please let's understand. Fuller is operating in United States of America, and the idea of the individual is very different in America as against in Europe. Okay, so where my house and my setup and my kind of self-reliance is seen together. In Europe, that idea was still a little bit more different. It was more about collective living and things like that, and I'll show you some of the experiments in that line. Okay, so this period of great environmental kind of movements started in 1960s and went on up to 1976. There are 2 or 3 other events that happened in between. One is, of course, the oil embargo that was set up by the kind of Saudi oil producing nations against the fact that Israel attacked a particular territory and things like that. In 1976, the first Habitat 1 kind of conference was held in Vancouver. Okay, the conference stated that unacceptable human settlement circumstances are likely to be aggravated by inequitable economic growth, uncontrolled urbanization, unless positive and concrete action is taken at national and international level. Okay. The world is now starting to look like operating together under the ambit, of course, of the United Nations. So the first action is to adopt meaningful and effective human settlement policies, spatial planning strategies, etc., etc. General principles of the, and I've put this over here because it's important for when you look at the presentation to go through some of these, because they actually make the kind of basis for some of the kind of later changes that have come in terms of the climate programs and things like that. Of course, the declaration stated that adequate shelter and services are basic human right, and that governments should assist local authorities to participate to a greater extent in national development. The declaration strongly emphasizes that the use and tenure of land should be subject to public control. Okay, here is a very important statement in there. What I found fascinating is that who were the important people who attended this conference. One of them is Margaret Mead, who was a social anthropologist and very active in the 1960s kind of free living kind of revolution or cultural revolution. Mother Teresa, okay, Buckminster Fuller, Paolo Soleri, and Maggie and Pierre Trudeau. These are the Canadian Prime Minister's parents, Justin Trudeau's parents. Yeah, so these are the important figures of the Habitat Forum. We are going to quickly look at Paolo Soleri, who is also in many ways similar to. I mean, at the core of it, his intention is the same as Buckminster Fuller's, is to establish efficiency of material use and reduce the impact on environmental resources, etc. But his experiment is very different. Where Buckminster Fuller actually went out and created his tests and prototypes with engineering and mechanization, etc., etc. Paolo Soleri, who was trained at the Taliesin West under Frank Lloyd Wright for a brief period of time when he moved from Turin in Italy to the US, actually set up an experiment that would last. That is a continuous experiment in any ways. Okay, so he began the construction of a place called Arcosanti. The goal of Arcosanti is to explore the concept of arcology, which is a word that brings architecture and ecology together. The project has the goal of combining social interaction and accessibility of an urban environment with sound environmental principles. Very different from Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller's idea of the urban environment was never sort of consolidated. In fact, he suggested that that the best way to actually maintain our environment now is to put a huge dome on top of Manhattan and hold everything within it, and you can have a better atmosphere on the inside. His entire kind of Montreal dome, which you saw in the first image that I showed you with Fuller, was an experiment towards that. The goal for Arcosanti, on the other hand, was to build something together, okay, with the land that was available, with the materials of the land, okay, and they started with very small, and their intention was to reach a population of 5,000. In this image, what you see in the darker gray where my cursor is the part of Arcosanti which is already constructed. What you see behind is something which was imagined as the second or third master plan that you will actually build this huge thing at the back. Yeah. Of course, it was called the project was called Two Suns kind of arcology, cities energized by the sun, where sun's exposure became the key. Many features are particular to the design and construction of Arcosanti. For example, tilt-up concrete panels are cast in bed of silt acquired from surrounding areas, giving the concrete a unique texture and color that helps it blend with the landscape. I'll show you some things. Many panels were cast with embedded art. Most buildings are oriented southwards to capture the sun's light and heat. Roof designs admit the maximum amount of sunlight in winter and minimal amount during the summer. Structure built to shelter bronze casting. So what they did in these spaces were actually bronze casting, bells, etc. That is the kind of economic activity of that place. Okay, but in the process, Paolo Soleri also created several kind of innovative designs of this kind of city that was partly underground, partly overground, etc., etc. Sorry, just a second, something is popping up. Yeah, this is Soleri on the right bottom. He's created these models for experimenting a bridge connection. Yeah, in the middle is some of the spaces inside the already constructed Akkosanthi kind of buildings. On the left, you see the grand kind of amphitheater, etc., etc. Yeah, sorry, I think I missed one slide. Okay, simultaneously. So this is happening in America. In Japan, also there were a group of architects that come together, and they call themselves the Metabolists. And I think this building we have studied very well last year in our I think in one of the courses, if I'm not mistaken, or was it with the earlier batch? We built a model of this building. So on the left hand side, you see the Nagakin capsule, which is a mixed-use residential office tower. The Metabolists, of course, they were post-war Japanese architectural movement that fused the ideas about architectural megastructures with those of organic biological growth. Yeah, and they in fact had their first exposure, international exposure, at the last Siam in 1959, where Kenzo Tange I think presented some of these ideas. So during the kind of preparation of the 1960s Tokyo World Design Conference, they prepared a publication and they prepared a Metabolist Manifesto. Okay, some of the things that the Metabolist Manifesto did was it created an idea of an ocean city, a space city. I'll show you some of those. So this is an idea of an ocean city that very soon land is going to not be habitable. Various reasons. This is Japan. Remember the idea, the relationship of land and its kind of availability, I think, changed after the entire nuclear explosion in Japan. And this is seen also in many of the contemporary kind of Japanese, if you see movies, if you see anime, you find that there is always this kind of presence of the bomb lingering. So this is something which they created, conceptual ideas, the ocean city. This was a space city which basically advocated the fact that minimal kind of exposure to ground and maximum exposure to the space above. Yeah, you had technologies today which and the entire experiment in the Nagakin Tower is exactly this, where you can actually create a central kind of a core infrastructure to which you can start plugging in and the entire thing can then keep growing as and when required. Okay, and I think these are the last 2 or 3 slides. I'm putting here someone named Yona Friedman, also during the same time, creating his idea of mobile city. Okay, and what Yona Friedman would also do is try and communicate his ideas in comic kind of forms. If you Google Yona Friedman, you'll find many of his drawings that appear in comic kind of conditions. I'm not going into Yona Friedman's work. That requires a little bit of time. I'm going to end at where we are today. Yeah, we are at a stage today where large scale destruction has been witnessed. We are at a stage where the pandemic has created conditions that are quite unnatural, including the fact that we are locked down and dispersed as social kind of beings. Some of the ideas that emerged in the 60s and later in the 90s that call for environmental kind of attention. One of them here is the ecological footprint, which is like a textbook that allows you to actually measure your own personal kind of footprint on environment, and then the entire ideas that emerge out of it, whether it is LEED kind of rating systems or the Griha rating systems, or or many others. That's the Griha rating system. I think I'm going to leave it at that. Rohan, Janela.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I'm
I think
Oh,
yes,
sorry. This
Chinmay.
was the last slide. Yeah, I wanted this to be the last slide. This is the Jetstar roller coaster in Seasides, New Jersey, after the Hurricane Sandy. The whole roller coaster was uprooted and landed in the sea and survived in this way. Sorry, I'll stop sharing, and we should open for conversation.
yeah. We didn't have any respondents today, did we?
We didn't
We didn't
force
pick.
respondents
No, we
today.
didn't
Yeah.
pick.
Yeah. So let's see if they have any response right now to just the ideas within the presentation. I think
Yeah.
what struck me about the presentation and about this idea of the apocalypse
Hmm.
is that this period, since the Second World War especially,
Yeah.
has seen like the scale of seeing the world has changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
That suddenly we see ourselves as part of these tumultuous movements and violences.
Yeah.
And also distances change. I mean, I was also thinking while you were talking about the atomic bomb, I was also talking about the idea of the space race. That
Yeah.
that you suddenly have the idea that somebody can walk on the moon and you can suddenly see this damn Earth from
Yeah.
somewhere else.
Yeah.
I think that also makes a difference too. I think in the way that somebody like Buckminster Fuller or Archie Graham even imagine the role of technology. They see it as like with unlimited possibilities, as
Yeah.
like playful possibilities. To me,
Absolutely.
it's somewhat different, the way that they look at the idea of technology than even what the modernists did. Well, the modernists were like, yeah, we'll form, follow, function, we'll make buildings for the great, like there are social cause, right? While in the 60s and all, it's like, man, it's amazing. Look what
Yeah.
technology can do,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
There
there's
is
a
a
sort of
Yeah, I
there is
think
a
like there is
sense.
also this reliance, like I think on technology so much, saying that because I mean also in the way what they've been seeing, both in terms of the devastation as well as like the nuclear bomb, and like there's this hope only in technology then to kind of take you forward,
yeah.
and that is why
There's
I feel like you're seeing it in like the way the cities, like like Aki Graham is making these cities, or even Fuller is kind of saying that let's put a dome over the entire place. I think it comes from this belief in technology kind of being the only savior then.
And what is interesting, what I find interesting is that actually that in people like Arco Santi and Paolo Soleri, these two tendencies, which is the hyper technological, okay, and the hyper environment, हाँ,
Yeah.
ये
Yeah.
वो पूरा engineering का जो फंडा है कि engineering nature को engineering में करेंगे, you know what I mean? There seems to be like the romantic यार नहीं यार ये technology is destroying us, we need to go back to nature, along with the fact that it's actually highly technological. Both
Yeah.
of them seem to meet in this kind of strange way. Even I find that same even in Archigram actually often.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like quite.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the drawings of this entire period. They're just full of joy. Like
Yeah.
really like colorful and playful and not like एकदम morose. मजा आता है मुझे देख.
Actually, what has also happened is that, and I was reading the entire history, the economic history of this period. Okay, so post Second World War, as the world starts to rebuild. Okay, one of the things that has happened is that there is a strategic shift from reliance on coal to reliance on oil. Okay, so that changes the entire kind of geopolitical kind of center of resource wealth. Okay, that center moves to the Arab countries, and there is the entire sort of conflict actually moves in that direction, and we find that playing out later in the 90s when the Gulf War actually finally struck. Okay, so there is that kind of a movement. Number one, and the second is that oil became very cheap. Okay, suddenly new oil wells were being created, and oil became cheap that could fuel energies and things like that. Okay, till of course the embargo in 73 or 74, when the Arab states basically said, we are not going to give you guys oil, because of Israel's kind of actions and things like that, and that actually sort of created this kind of tension in the kind of powerful states of Europe and America, that sala oil nahi dega तो अपना बच गया, you know, basically. हाँ, तो अपन क्या करेगा? Okay, and that kick starts the entire the kind of third war kind of a race, you know, where now we better get control of that resource, and it's ridiculous, this whole way in which it has moved now.
So I mean, I was just thinking of like even the fact of the, like you brought up, ये pandemic का जो फंडा है, you know, and I'm really thinking about how the idea of disaster or apocalypse, this idea that we always, like, we as architects or as people, we always see ourselves as part of history making. There's this sort of across this whole 50 years, you see that that architects have taken upon themselves this act of history making.
Yeah,
And not
exactly.
history writing as much as history making.
Making.
That they're not necessarily thinking about the past as much as you're thinking about how will the future see us.
Yeah.
What did we do today to mark the future? And I was telling that we haven't told these guys what our lecture series is yet, but I thought that would be a good idea to even kind of perhaps maybe that is something that we are thinking of really kind of considering even for this time's lecture series. I thought would also be an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
Anyway, we should open it out for the kids.
Open it up to the kids for responses.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, this is actually, there is so much that can be actually brought into this kind of a narrative, and I've chosen only to limit to certain kinds of ideas. Okay, essentially, if we use the apocalypse kind of trope to unpack what reconfigurations to modernities have been, okay, we can actually really unearth many more kind of tendencies. Yeah, the response to environment and the act of war are just two of these kind of tendencies. Yeah. But I'm sure that if we spend some more time, we can actually unearth quite a few kind of interrelations that are actually happening. And of course, in this presentation, we did not focus on what is happening in the global south. Okay.
Yeah.
We were primarily looking at the kind of north and the kind of western world. Yeah. But global south itself is also in turmoil in the 60s and 70s. Like in the earlier presentation, we had put in the timeline some of the things that are happening. Your Naxal kind of situations are emerging in India. There is the whole drive to control population that is happening across China and India. You know, like strange kind of
all the big decolonizations
and the big decolonization. So nations sprouting up continuously. Actually, that is another story which happens. And if you read the history of United Nations, they talk a lot about how continuously new nations kept coming up and approaching the United Nations to intervene in their own interconflicts. You know. And so for example, the two nations became independent, but they were in a situation of war with each other, ran to the United Nations. United Nations intervenes and things like that. So of course, simultaneously, many of these things happening in the rest of the world also. Yeah, let's open it up if anybody has any responses. I have in front of me, I have Soham, Yash, Ananya. Soham, Yash, and Ananya. Anyone? Okay, let's pick someone else.
They are not there, or at least they should respond. Like say hello, we have nothing to say, something or the other.
Yash, are you there? So sorry, I'm losing network, Ananya says.
No one is saying anything. So there's somebody's losing network. So they all lose network. They all lose network when we ask them to say something. Na? It's magical.
Yeah. Bol, Soham, what did you think? Have some responses. Make us feel relevant in some way. Or worthwhile, rather.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Yash, bol na.
So this whole top conversation about the World War, I wanted to ask a question. Have you all seen The Man in the High Castle?
No.
No,
Which
I've
a
not
TV
seen.
show which is based on the fact what if the Hitler never lost the World War? What if
Okay.
Hitler had won the World War, and then it's a full story about that in the
Mm-hmm.
future where Nazis are ruling over the world.
Mm-hmm.
Is it
Interesting.
fun?
Yeah.
It's intriguing.
Mm-hmm.
What are the sorts of things that they speculate on if Hitler had won the war? क्या बोलते हैं वो लोग?
It's the classic one where the people are in the people are underground and they're holding a resistance against Hitler and the
अच्छा.
German oppression, the supreme race, and
Yeah, so I wanted to hi Ritik here.
Hi,
So
Ritik.
basically, I wanted to continue that to Yash only. So if so, I have seen the series, and in that the whole America is captured by Germany from the north and Japan towards the south, and the central part is kept as the free nation or the free state, but that part is not allowed to have the army. So basically, the whole thing is reversed. So all the allegations which were put on the Germany after the Treaty of Versailles is shown in the movie. That what if Hitler had won the war?
Mm.
So it was a nice thing. Yes.
Interesting.
Do you all watch a lot of World War films?
Ritik, do you watch a lot of World War films? Yash?
Yeah, so not really, but I've seen the World War series. There are two series, so on Netflix also. So I've seen both of them about the World War II, and
So
like capturing capturing the main events start from the start and towards the end.
I actually had a general question, maybe. So, if I had to kind of ask you guys about, let's say, the history of World War II, where did you all learn it? In history, or do you remember your histories, or did you mainly learn it through like TV shows and movies and things like that?
No, we had World War history in school.
Yeah, 10th standard ICSE.
But you guys remember it?
I mean, not the dates, of course, but like vaguely, yeah.
I never. Yeah.
Dates, of course.
Dates are the worst. Dates are like, people say 1976 in my head becomes 1967. Somehow it automatically happens like that. I have no idea. But so where does your entire history of the world end nowadays? Where do they end it? At the end of ICSE?
We ended with, at least like in my school, we ended with like modern India, like after independence, the constitution and all.
Acha, so do you get to the emergency and things like that?
We studied like in ninth grade we studied modern history of the world, and then 10th grade we did India, and yeah, it ended with the formation of the constitution. Yeah, that's it. That was the
So
last chapter.
up to 1947, 1950 or something like that.
Yeah.
So you guys never really study about what is happening in the world after 1950. That is the next 70 years, that 1950 to 2020. That 70-year period is not part of our history. Or do you all learn about it in other places? How does that work? No, even I studied the same, so I'm only asking. That history, and I studied like 20 years back now. Yeah, sorry, 30 years back now.
I
So
think
if
I mean, we don't study about it in school, definitely. That'll probably be the curriculum of the future generation.
you are the future generation, my dear.
No, they are done
like
with schooling. They are done with schooling.
After
Yeah,
us.
they are done with schooling.
No, I was actually wondering, because this
But
period
yeah.
after 1950, like things like the Cold War. You know what the Cold War is? Does any of you guys know what the Cold War is?
Yeah, between USA and USSR, which
Right,
split.
absolutely. Yeah. And do you know when it ended?
Forgot the date.
1990-ish.
Good. No,
Yeah.
not bad at all. That was the year that those were the times when the entire all that alliance of the communist bloc completely collapsed. Like
Shattered, yeah.
overnight.
Shattered.
And you have you have to think about what that meant for me. Yeah, like when you're growing up, your world is one very particular kind. Yeah, you're getting only a certain, like there's Russia and there's the US, and you think the world is like this and it's going to be like that. Then one day you wake up and damn, the Soviet Union
there is no USSR.
You're like, what the hell? Where did it go?
Yeah.
It was crazy. That was just completely wild. The entire the thing is that even and actually if you read the history now, I would highly recommend that, like if you read about the history over the past 50-70 years, and especially like in a city like Berlin, which I think is just like a city that has constantly gone under, like it's one city that I think over that period of time has undergone like redevelopment every 10 years or 20 years. It's like one ridiculous place. First it was the war, okay, then it was the building of the wall, then it was the kind of breaking down of the
wall. Yeah.
So it was like, and every time there were large scale constructions that happened. And each of those constructions represented a very different imagination of what it meant to be, like, how architects, Anna, they like to say that we are designing for the future. So each of these architects at that time approached the projects very, very differently. It's quite an interesting thing.
Yeah.
But what do you guys think? Actually, I would really like to know that, this entire COVID thing that we have right now, right? It has really changed so many people's lives, nah? Hey, let's get two people responding officially. I need their faces.
I know. I think Sana is here. Sana, please speak.
Yeah, let's get Sana, turn your camera on.
Turn on your camera so we can.
Sana, turn on your camera. Like, let's get some people in here. Prasad, turn on your camera.
Prasad, please.
Sana and Prasad are our respondents for today.
Okay.
Sana and Prasad, please turn your cameras on, my dear.
Yeah. Madhura, let's get Madhura also.
All right, cool.
Madhura, please say hi to us.
There she is.
Finally. She's real. She's actually real. She's there.
Oh, yeah.
She's Hi.
Hi.
Some lovely kind of foliage in the background as well.
Yeah.
And there's like a soft backlit glow around her like a Santosh Sivan Tamil film heroine. Like this.
Oh my God.
Who else? Please, where is this one?
Prasad.
Prasad, please.
Hi, Prasad.
Oh, you can see. I can't see Prasad.
I can see him. He's just come online.
How?
Yeah, I don't know. He's on backlit glow. And that's Sana. Madhura. Sorry, Madhura.
Shit, why is that?
So I had a question for you guys, all three of you. Any of you all can answer. That do you think that this kind of large, how do you think architects are going to respond, or we have to respond to this COVID crisis? Or do you think it's going to stay just the same?
I mean, I feel like in the beginning of the year, we had like a series of lectures done by Sandeep where we were talking about the new situation, COVID situation, and we realized that every time there has been a sort of evolution with regards to like diseases or whatever, there has always been some sort of change within architecture. Like if you talk of the green roofs or like terraces or even city planning. And we were also talking about how Le Corbusier used to had designed a house where you have you have a sort of basin before the entrance. So it's like you wash your hands as soon as you enter, and that's something we sort of do, right? Like as soon as we enter the house, we sanitize, and then we like go within the house. Then we have to like wash our hands and feet or whatever. So I'm not really sure if it will affect like long-term architecture, if it's just a thing, because right now the vaccine's out and everyone has a lot of hope from it. But yeah. So.
Do you think that we learned something because of the pandemic about the way that we live in these cities? And does any of you believe that we learned something about?
Yeah, like what I experienced, like how everyone after like few months, everyone's like going crazy ki I don't want to be at one place. So like how as an architect we failed to create a space like the house itself. Like within like 2-3 months and 4 months, like people started getting crazy. I want to go out and like And like so like there were a lot of articles about these things, like how some houses lack balcony or like such spaces where they can get the connect. And so yeah, like as a Agra we'll have like there will be some change where we need to rethink how it's going on. And like
So you think that architects are going to be more aware of the need that we have for social interaction? Because before that, architects were like private property है, बड़े बड़े बिल्डिंग बनाएंगे, चकाचक घर अच्छा करेंगे, और end of हमारा architecture. Private is. Do you think that we learn that it's important that human beings require physical social space, not only the screen?
yeah, like मतलब like Charles Korea का Borivali LIC building, it's like the Steiger Terrace thing. So it's a good example where like there's a connect with the nature and like the outside. So not all architects were having that thing, but yeah, as a architect we need to rethink the connect.
But I'm just wondering. So but your home itself, you're saying is also a problem now, that it doesn't allow you to create interactions.
Yeah.
So you're also questioning what is your home, and the ability. So for example, I'll give you my example over here right now. The only people that we have interacted with is our neighbors next door, primarily because the kids like to go to their house. But every time they travel somewhere, or someone goes out like that, we have to create a separation of 6 days or 7 days between us. But we have been able to form that kind of a community only because there are neighbors over here with whom we are able to interact in the corridor. Okay. That there is some kind of an access to the other person. And what you're saying is also true, that the balcony can become that place from where I can actually still continue to have my interactions. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like
in the absence of that, in the way we structure our homes. Okay. Whereas what Rohan is saying is that whether we have come to realize that the structuring of public space is also essential. I think he's trying to say that that since we have lost that, we are realizing the importance of real public spaces where we used to meet and where we used to see the other. And in his case, the other is the absolute other, who's unknown also. Unknown, the unknown other, strangers.
When was the last time I met a stranger? Yeah, just think about it. Huh? Like, really, when was the last time I met somebody I don't know? I'm living in this house. Okay, everybody I'm meeting is familiar with me. You know what I mean? And it's damn weird if you think about it. Yeah. The only time you meet somebody whom you don't know is a flattened surface on the screen because you're watching him on video or she or her on video. Na? So it's damn strange. I was wondering whether, do you think that, like, so I was thinking, like, let's talk about that. Okay, let's say now we are at a time now that is equivalent. I mean, there has never been such, I mean, there has been, but such a global shutdown of everything. Has not happened in centuries, my friend. You are living through a historic moment. Okay. And I never thought there would be something like this in a lifetime. Na? That the entire world just कोई बोला brakes लगा दो. ठीक है. अभी and architects are like, हम करेंगे. We are doing my project is modernist. I am building a very efficient building. Oh, I am building, a public space, a connectivity. यार बात करने में तो हम यार, and we all act as like, oh यार, we care so much for our world, man. यार इतना दुख है हमारी लाइफ में. ये लोग कितने दुखी है, लेबर लोग, ये लोग कितने दुखी है, और हम है ना आर्किटेक्ट, हम आकर तुम्हारे प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व करेगा. मेरा है ना डिजाइन. So it seems to be like the presumption that architects have कि हमारे हाथ में है ये जादू की छड़ी, जैसे हम ऐसे फिश करके करेंगे, और ऐसे हम तो सोच रहे थे कि हम ऐसे काम कर रहे हैं, लेकिन 1 साल पहले हमने देखा कि हम जितने भी जादू की छड़ियां हमारे हाथ में है बिल्कुल यूजलेस है, क्योंकि हमारा we were useless, no? Doctors were more useful. Policemen were more useful. Farmers were more useful. All of these people were way more useful than us, no? At the end of it. Yet we go about acting like the superior people. We are the greatest, we know. But I mean, that is one thing that we do. Architecture, by its very nature, we'll continue to do it. समझ रहे हो ना? We cannot not do it. वो भी problem है. But the question is कि if I have to ask you now, that if this is a historic moment, okay, like the World War was, like the atom bomb was, like the collapse of the Berlin Wall was, like actually in many ways the fall of the 9/11 towers was World Trade Center.
Yeah.
Okay, and like for us, the attack on the Bombay Taj was. Okay, and like for us today, Shaheen Bagh from last year and the farmers' protest from this year these are things that have not happened, man, for years. Okay.
Yeah.
When was the last time? I don't remember a time when like thousands of tractors gathered outside the city of Delhi, not allowing anything to happen. I don't remember such a thing happening.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if we imagine that we are living in this sort of historical moment, and as architects, we continue to believe that it is our job to provide for the greater common good. हमारा job है यार. तो हमें कुछ तो बदलना पड़ेगा ना. तो क्या बदलेंगे? अच्छा चल, क्या बदलेंगे छोड़. वो तो दूर की बात है. वो तो बहुत बड़ा क्वेश्चन पूछ लिया हमने. मैं पूछ रहा हूँ कि what do you think architects will do?
Hold more competitions.
Hold more
Like-
competitions.
Good point.
Like
Yeah, good more competition.
they
Yeah.
already there have been so many competition about like imagining after COVID cities, public spaces.
Work from home scenarios, new kinds of ways in which the house is changing.
I think Lajja
How-
was saying
Yeah.
that in the chat box.
Yeah, and she's right.
Yeah.
The relationship between, like, yesterday I went to Powai and I looked at an office building over there. ठीक है, पूरा office building पूरा empty है. ठीक है, no one is going to go there. Everybody is working from home. You realize actually that you didn't need offices only for most of the time. Is that funny? Yeah. Who's saying something? Shrestha is saying something. It's a long text. I can't read it much.
Also, in terms of urban planning, a lot of people have also started thinking more about slums and sanitary issues, the close quarters and bad planning cause. Like everyone was already about this, but we managed to sweep it under the rug because it was never affecting us. So hopefully we will be more considerate and aware in future when it comes to designing public housing. Okay. Madhura is saying something. The definition of a relationship that two people can have is also changing. Correct, Madhura? Is that
Madhura,
what you mean?
What do you
Now
mean?
people have friends who they've only met like on screen. Like my brother got a new job and he's like buddies with his colleagues now, and they've only met online. So it's very strange to see him work and actually get to know so many people. In that
I don't know. I don't know what happens to romantic relationships online. I mean,
I was actually thinking about that. I was thinking that 12 months is a long time to be without physical intimacy
separation. Yeah. I mean, 12 months is officially required for a divorce also, right? That separation.
Exactly. It's like a period of separation.
After that, you can actually legally say that we are not together. Okay.
I'm sorry for getting kind of maybe slightly graphic on this, but these you kids are like all of like 19 to 20 whatever years old. Your hormones must be raging wild, yeah. Like this must be like a thing. How do you deal with love and romanticism and stuff like that? Yeah. And I realized that it must be all like standing in the balcony so that your parents can't hear you and whispering, "Nee, meri maa nahi hai, meri maa hai abhi, main baad mein baat karti hu." They think the house, the space, and you can't even talk to the person on FaceTime or whatever screen because somebody from behind might see your screen. It must be like a complete nightmare, yeah. Crazy.
Yeah.
So it's actually,
we are not. We have never really actually opened this up as that it's not so normal, nah? Meaning that stay at home is not only about whether I have the space or not. It's also about my anonymity. I don't have anonymity anymore. Okay. My privacy is not there. So how can I have anonymity in the absence of privacy, right? So I mean, I don't know how you guys are how you guys are managing things.
So I think that this idea of health is one of those things that we've learned, and like Shrestha says, hopefully we'll pay mind to the fact that our cities have to be healthy. And the health infrastructure has to be accessible to everybody. We found that to be true, right? What we also found is just how unsustainable our cities are in terms of the food and water. That our entire supply chains broke down. The only and we treated our supply chains with such disdain. अरे हाँ जाएंगे कहाँ से तो भी लाएंगे खाना, हमें खाना मिल रहा है ना, that's all that we cared about. Our entire kind of workforce who really runs the city was left with absolutely no help whatsoever. Can we really, whether this pandemic has been able to reconsider these priorities that we have as architects, or do we then treat the pandemic as a way, like kind of Prasad is saying, or a cool competition for more cool ideas? That's what we'll get, like, so pandemic style architecture, which means I don't know what, I have no idea what that means. Colorful, maybe coronavirus on the facades.
Yeah. So
my concept is coronavirus. My building is shaped like coronavirus.
Corona shaped building, circle and.
Yes. यार तू मैं झूठ नहीं बोल रहा हूँ. You will find these projects. मैं thesis के लिए जाता हूँ ना, मैंने देखे ऐसे सब. मैं बता रहा हूँ तुझे.
Nishanti is saying, I think we are also seeing massive queer spaces online because of this lack of anonymity at home. And
what does that mean, Nishanti?
Nishanti?
Could you elaborate that a little bit?
I mean, like, there's a very, very large queer community that's being formed online, wherein children are and teenagers are kind of expressing themselves in ways that they are much more comfortable doing online. Rather, I mean, it's if it's hard for like straight kids to video chat, I mean, it would be much more.
Right,
but Nishanti, sorry Nishanti, I'm just trying to understand. So so it's easier for me to face chat with a boy than it is with a girl. Is that why you say that? In our home social context?
I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying
no. I'm asking actually. I'm wondering rather whether that is what is at play. Like my mom would not have a problem if I'm talking to a boy, and if I was a girl, my mom doesn't have a problem that I'm talking to a girl. Oh, chal, ladki ke sath baat kar rahe.
No, I think it's not that. I think what's happening, if you ask me, Shirish, I think this is what I think is also part of the empowerment of what the screen allows. The screen allows you to perform a person that you may want to be, but you can't be. Because because the surroundings that you inhabit, you have to be who you are in some extent. But on screen, I can become who I want to be. I can perform something else. So I can express who I really am sometimes more within the screen space than I can in reality. Yeah. So my true desires might be possible to be expressed as on the screen rather than this. Maybe that is also a possibility. So
but I don't know how it happens with the camera. Like for example, right now you are seeing me in as raw as the screen can be, right? There's nothing blurred over here. If the kids come over here, then you're seeing that. You're seeing somebody walking behind, all of that. Like how do I hide all that?
I see. Already you can blur backgrounds. That's one thing that you can do. You can also kind of, you need not have your camera on,
all
in many ways, all the time, right? This allows you to kind of have different levels of interfaces, maybe. I was thinking, and actually, and for me, this question is actually also architectural in many ways. If our entire sort of world, this is maybe just, if I say, what is the architecture profession 20 years from now? Okay, let's say, where you guys are going to be working. And I say, if this is really the beginning of the complete virtualization of architecture, then should we be training these students in the design of the architecture of the
virtual
internet or the virtual
space?
Would that be the kind of architecture of the future? Is that where we are on the cusp of right now? And maybe the apocalypse has just pushed us further into that direction.
And then but the question then is that who then designs the real?
Yeah, it's a good
Okay,
question.
so
What's
if
the
we
real and outcome of everything that's being designed in the virtual?
Yeah, but Ron, Nishanti, can you explain a little bit more what you meant? Actually, I'm still not able to. How is that happening? What you're saying, and why is it happening? You think?
So, I mean, firstly, not everybody is really comfortable. Like Rohan was saying, you kind of are allowed to explore who you really are, and I mean, I guess this is like a third person perspective, so maybe I'm not the best person to ask. But also things like gender expression and ways in which people are comfortable really embodying who they are. So I mean, most like I don't know Twitter accounts and things like that. Everybody's pretty anonymous, and you're allowed to sort of express that kind of part of yourself without having to really withstand the abuse that would come with it in like a real life sort of setting, which is what I'm assuming is.
Okay.
It's a
Okay.
I think the ability of the internet to work as a mask is actually in many ways a very empowering thing. For example, I'm being, even in my studio space when I'm teaching a second year design studio or third year design studio, or even I find that sometimes some students are much more comfortable typing or a query rather than saying or asking something face to face. Because I think what happens is that their bodies, a sense of shame or fear pervades the presence of the body. And I think what the screen does is that it allows some sort of masking, a distancing. So they don't get so directly attached to what the text is, but rather they treat it as something that is a barrier in some way, and that might also be a empowering thing. I mean, I have no.
No, I'm not saying that it will not be. I think it will be. I'm just trying to understand how it actually plays, in its relationship with the physical space actually. Okay, while there is the
Shiru, I did this interview with Jon so Jon is a friend of ours. Friend of ours in the Netherlands, and he had this he was curating a sort of exhibition called on intimacy in Rotterdam, sorry, just during the pandemic. During which, so he had asked me because of the pandemic to do a web sort of event thingy, in which his idea was intimacy in the time of COVID. And at that time, actually, I really started thinking about something, even what Nishanti was saying, that what does intimacy mean when 6 people are living in a room, okay, or 7 people are in a house, okay? How does one develop kinds of questions of sexuality, for example, young men and women, or even kind of married families? How do they deal with the sexual, over a period of 8 months when nobody can step out of the house?
Yeah.
What kind of forms do the sexualities take? Even if it is going to be on screen, that screen is not necessarily a private screen. The screen is visible to many people, and sound is another matter entirely, right? Because sound, I can wear earphones so that what I'm hearing can't be heard by somebody else, but what I'm speaking can, right?
Yeah.
So it's a really kind of complicated way in which your body in physical space, like Shirish was saying, becomes implicated with new kinds of boundaries.
Yeah.
Which are not the building physical boundaries, but there's a boundary of seeing, hearing, the length of or the distance your body's aura emanates just in terms of its presence, and another body's presence within that space. It's a very strange new kind of idea and how do you perform that intimacy? So that's why, the balcony, the staircase lobby, you go to the edges of the entire thing, stand in the window, hope that people won't hear what you're saying. You do all of these things to try and make sure that you get some sense of the private as far as possible. I mean, that's what I was assuming. I know I also had a conversation with some queer friends of mine, and actually it was through them I realized that how do you deal with the question of the sexual in times like these? And then when you're thinking about kind of the idea of space, how does it bloody hell happen? Yeah. And what the future of that is going to be? The thing is this. There is one thing that has happened over this time is that we become more and more afraid of the other person's body. That we see every other person's body as a sort of possible sort of diseased body.
So I have another kind of a question, an extended question. Are some people more lucky than others in this situation because of the way the space is structured, because of the way their families are structured, because of the way I'm just trying to think that some did some people luck out in this big time, in this kind of locked mode, and I'm just wondering. I mean, what has actually happened, because we have not really sort of we are speaking to only each other, Ron, you know what I'm saying, right? So what happens in that case is that we are not really exposed to, unless of course if there are other kind of platforms through which we are discovering the absolute unknown, okay, albeit with restrictions, yeah. But most of us are actually just sort of in our world. So, for example, my world right now is you guys in this. I know every one of you. You know me and my family. Okay, and that's it. So it's limited to that. So I'm just wondering whether some people really lucked out in this. I don't know. I don't know what that could be.
Honestly, feel that when you talk about that, I feel people who already are comfortable with themselves and their identities in that case might have, because of certain situations, but people who haven't like really explored themselves, I feel in that sense everyone has lucked out, because you only understand who you are in an external space when you communicate with other people. And if you haven't really discovered yourself, I don't think, like, no matter what space you are in or what sort of environment you are in, it would be quite difficult, in my opinion, though. I don't really know.
Okay. Interesting. Very interesting. How do we discover ourselves in the like, do we only do it through the virtual, or the physical is very much required for discovering ourselves? Okay, that's a very important thing. I mean, social interaction is not only something that we just feed from, it's also something that makes us. So it's not just a consumptive kind of a condition, right? It is actually, my entire thing is made because of my interaction with the others in certain kinds of, in different conditions actually, and physical being a very important condition of those. I don't know whether we can live without that, whether we can form identities without that. Ron, I'm asking you and Nishanti, I don't know what kind of identities get formed in such cases which are absolutely non-physical. And I mean, I don't know the answer.
I understand what you mean, where you're coming from, but as a sort of, you have to try and understand that the queer body is anyway a body that is perpetually out of place.
Okay, okay, correct.
So any alliance that the queer body makes with its surrounding is always a performance anyway. What this really enables one to do is that it enables you to transcend the physical boundary of your body and build alliances with other such people from around the world.
Okay.
Because I think that to kind of understand the queer body is to understand the fundamentally subaltern. That society itself is structured in such a way that the queer body will perpetually be at the outsider. So anytime the queer body has to kind of, like, even if I look at what the queer body has, let's say it's a masculine, let's say men know how to perform in the world, okay, because they have images of heterosexual or heteronormative men telling them that this is the way that one is supposed to be, okay, and they in many ways can fit themselves into that surrounding as best as they can, okay. They don't necessarily entirely fit, but they have an image that they are supposed to be like. For the queer body, even that alliance, not with a person, but even with an image of who this person is supposed to be, does not exist. Okay? So what the queer body does, I think, and this is my theorization based on actually some people I'm reading, what the queer body does, that it takes the best possible fit. It takes Marilyn Monroe,
Okay.
let's say, okay, or it takes from popular culture. I'll say, yeah, kind of like Marilyn Monroe, I feel. No? So I'll don the garb of Marilyn Monroe. I'll don the garb and I'll pose like. So actually queer existences in many ways are existences within the world of masks.
Or the world of representations.
I in the world of absolutely, in the world of representations, right? And it's through these sorts of collagings of different representations that identities are formed. Because the identity doesn't come, like you said, the identity is of course something that you're feeling, but you don't know what it means unless it's represented somewhere else. So you take pieces of where you see it from, and you quickly kind of collage them together to form your identity.
Okay.
Well, I think what virtual allows you to do, it allows you to access these images and these worlds a little bit better. Maybe that's my reading of what Nishant is saying. My own kind of realization.
Okay. Interesting. Very interesting.
But I'm still going to kind of say that we are still not talking really about the fundamental question that's going to plague us in the future. Is that given the fact that this is a turning point in many ways for our imaginations of what our role is in the world, or it should be, even if it is not, it should be a place that we really think about what our roles are going to be. The question for you guys who are going to be the architects of the future is that, how do you think your futures are going to be shaped by this moment? Not that we expect an answer now. I think it's an important thing to think about, and it's good to think about it through other historical examples. I think if you look at some of the moments that Shirish himself showed us and look at them a little more deeply, look at the metabolists and look at the...
Actually, look at Yona Friedman is very interesting, Rohan, because Yona Friedman never really built much, okay? And he was always criticized that all his ideas are actually in the representative kind of realm. But he always said that, well, I was always moving towards building in my representations. Okay, and always sort of so I think our role is also in the realm of creating new representations, right? We are not only as architects. Okay, so whether you say that whether we will design the virtual or we'll design something else, so we are also creators of that mode of representation. Okay, so I think that could be.
You're saying that actually. Even the representation of the virtual world that we could inhabit
is also
could be an architectural gesture.
Yeah, it is.
So maybe that's the future of thinking about how this apocalypse is going to affect us.
I mean, Lebbeus Woods never really built things, you know. Yeah. He was always drawing. He was always imagining a future through his drawings. That was his way of representing the future. And I think there is that role we have never really defined as the role of the architect necessarily. Okay, although we have examples who have lived their entire careers like that.
From Boulez to Corbusier, they've done their work like that. Across. Yeah. Frank Lloyd Wright, every single great architect has involved himself in some sort of speculative architecture. That's the thing. You know, it's been Does anyone else have anything to contribute to the conversation? Anything actually?
Yeah, like how we were talking about like Yona Friedman or Lebbeus Woods work, which kind of some like right now some architects or architecture students take it as a case study and try to devolve it in their own word. So maybe like now is a moment where we make such representation or like conceptual ideas of future virtual spaces, and like in future maybe they can make that happen or something like that.
Probably.
Maybe, but also I mean, for you guys it will be important to contextualize their work and to sort of because you know I also go on these juries and they give case studies and people don't like the idea of the case study itself is so this thing, you know, you just not really looked at it, you've not understood the context at all. So my suggestion would be to always try to contextualize the work and see what it has. See what you can learn from it, you know.
I think important questions to, you know, is that the apocalypse is not a joke. That's an important
exactly.
thing to remember. You know,
Yeah.
too often architects love the idea of apocalypse so that they can do cool drawings.
Yeah.
But what if the water came and killed everybody? Whoa, how cool! Sexy drawing banega, yaar. You know, there's that idea, no? Which of course is very entertaining if you're making science fiction films. Right? I love those drawings. Fantastic. I love the stories also those can tell. But at some level, our job is to try and make things better. No? So to think about if that happens, what does that mean for lots of things is the question that we have to ask ourselves. I love playful fiction stuff, and they can be great fun to do. But I think one also has to be a little careful that one does not fall into parody. Ye joke ban jayega sab. But it's a good. But I agree with you, Prasad. I think any kind of transformation can only happen by beginning to imagine a transformation. And you can only imagine things by writing them, drawing them, projecting them.
Okay. All right. Rohan, shall we?
Sure. Yeah. Next week, I think we'll have Janella's kind of talking about history.